afternoon, and this is the video edition of Rants and Raves, my blog. So this is my vlog. It is very, very early in the morning up here in the cold lands of North Yankee Land, and hopefully soon winter will be gone and the piles of snow will have melted off my drive. But this episode is called Left, Right, Center, Up, and Down. This is, you could regard this as an adjunct to my ruling class crisis series, of which more anon. But I'm using the terms right and left, and I'm going to be using them more and such. And I thought I would go on a bit about exactly what I'm talking about here. If you saw my previous video, on maps, which was called Hominem unius tabula timeo, I fear the man of one map. You know that I was talking about maps of reality and such. What sorts of maps were visual representations we use to represent reality. At any rate, this is a little bit deeper about the political universe. Remember, I showed you one about the red and blue divides within the various states and such. I only touched briefly upon that. But at any rate, it's customary to talk about political divisions as being left and right. And this goes back, I believe, to the French Chamber of Deputies when the more conservative royalist elements and such would sit on the right side of the chamber, and the more radical elements would sit on the anti-monarchical elements would sit on the left and such. And among us libertarians, of course, there's a certain amount of debate as to whether libertarian is actually left or right. And some say it's a bit of both. It's socially liberal and fiscally, economically conservative and such, which seems to be less and less relevant. A lot of people don't like that, and I would have you know that I'm probably not a typical libertarian at any rate. But to begin with, this is something I said during the 2016 election when left and right was lining up. Now, this is significant because left-right stuff started to break down. A lot of the opposition to Donald Trump actually came from the right. There were the never-Trumpers within the Republican Party, and there were those who said, "Hey, it's better to let Hillary win than to let that crazy bastard win." Some have changed their minds, some have not. But what I said at the time was, someday I'm going to learn to do graphics, and I won't have to do this. Election, the center, left, right. And what I said was right here around the middle, and there's a lot of research seems to indicate that this is actually where most Americans are. Maybe a little bit over here, that we're a center-right country. But these are the people that looked at the election, threw up their hands and said, "Oh my God, this is awful. It's a terrible choice, but grit your teeth and vote for Hillary or vote for Trump." And what I said at the time was, okay, some of these people are wrong, but both of them are sane. Now over here at the, where am I? Excuse me, I have to remind myself that this is not a mirror. So over at the, what I call the hard left, there are the people who said that she's a saint, she's never done anything wrong, and she's been cruelly slandered by a 30-year campaign of libel. And then over on the right here, you had people, and by the way, some of these people unfriended me and called me everything but a child of God when I said, you all do remember that this guy was a Democrat about 5 minutes ago. They said, Trump is sent by God to save America. Now, as I said, these people here, choice is terrible, but Hillary/Trump is better than Trump/Hillary. That's it. Some of them are wrong, but both of them are sane. Like the people on either end here, neither. They're nuts. Sorry, they're crazy. People over on the Hillary side and people on the Hillary side have ignored a mountain of evidence that Helen Keller could read by touch from beyond the grave. That the lady is corrupt clear through and always has been. Then on the other side, there's mostly I hear from people who, admit that he's not a perfect human being, but he's a better choice. But no, I mean, but occasionally, I think their numbers are the numbers of he's a perfect human being are perhaps smaller because face it, that's kind of hard to maintain like that. But I have seen things like the family portrait and people going, "Oh, what a beautiful family with what great family values." I'm going, you guys are aware that those are 10 children and grandchildren and whatever from 3 different mothers, and so okay. So that's more or less the traditional left-right thing I have here, which left-right. Conservatives on the right, liberals on the left, and traditionally the extremes tend to go towards and it goes from liberal to socialist to communist to whatever, and on the right the notion is the extreme right goes to fascist, white nationalist, whatever, things like that. Now, there's an awful lot wrong with that. Well, one, there's going to be inevitably an awful lot wrong with any linear graph of politics, because and there are attempts to fix this, but to begin with, Nazism and fascism were in fact originally regarded by the Nazis and fascists as a variety of socialism, a non-Marxist socialism. The Nazis didn't want to be lumped in with the Marxists because Marx by heritage was a Jew, and the fact that he was a non-practicing Jew, that he despised Judaism, that he hated his rabbi father and all that, it doesn't matter to them, because they define Jew as a race, not as a religion or a subculture, or a what we call a deme in anthropology, which I touched on in my presentation on what is this thing called democracy. Now, what I noticed there, nonetheless, there are some things about left and right that do make sense here, and it's there is a tendency, is the left are do this people, and the right are don't do this people, as you can see up here, meaning that programs that the left espouses tend to be in nature of a larger, more intrusive government policy and such, which saying you have to do this, and said you must buy, health insurance from a government-approved list of, whatever. Furthermore, that health insurance must cover things like, I have a friend, a woman in her 60s, single, no children, who lost her insurance policy because it didn't cover pediatric dentistry. You must bake the cake. You must deal with anyone who walks through the door of your business. These are all do this things. Whereas on the right are more don't do this people. They're more like, if the laws, certain sorts of obnoxious laws, like, don't open your business on Sunday, don't smoke weed, don't gamble, don't do these kinds of things. I'd point out there that while either kind of law can be obnoxious and oppressive, one crucial difference is that it's almost always easier to avoid or discreetly break the don't do this laws. Because if you have a do this law, that means somebody is coming looking for you to make sure you have done this. Don't do this laws usually means somebody's looking around. If they don't see evidence of it, unless they've specifically got it in for you, they're not going to look all that hard. Again, there are exceptions, and there are exceptions here. The authoritarian right over here, like that, used to have a very big do this, and there are calls to have it do this again, which is do give X, 2 years of your life to the military, to the whatever, anything like that. Basically, lately there have been calls on the right, conscious of the fact that the whole educational system is geared towards left indoctrination. They want 2 years of your undivided attention so they can, indoctrinate you their way. It is, as I say, nonetheless true, touching on remarks about Nazis, fascists, communists, which are alleged to be the extremes of right and left. So, we have something called the horseshoe theory, which bends that line. It's still linear, but it bends it right that, and it points out a very essential truth about all extremists and fanatics. Extremists and fanatics of all kinds, religious, atheist, left, right, whatever things, that the fanatics have more in common with each other personality-wise than they do with the moderates within their own group, their own culture, whatever. Yeah. Oh, yes. And I've been called names for pointing this out. And I point out, Antifa. Antifa are the brothers by another mother of white nationalists, and there are more of them. Oh God, people got bent out of shape. Coffee morning. Okay, so there are those of us who think that we need either other kinds of maps, and usually we want to add another dimension. Now there are circular maps, which I don't have here because they essentially say the same thing. But here is another proposal over here. Now this goes left, right, but also center and up and down. And then it, unlike, it doesn't make a graph. It makes a diamond graph over here. So, which puts libertarian at the top, statist at the bottom, and then left, right, which recognizes another thing, that there are two dimensions to this, is that how much government do we want in our lives, how big a government we want on this axis, and left, right, what we want the government to do on this axis here. And then you have the people in the middle. This is, you could call this a general average of the country. Now, the thing about general averages I would like to point out is, if you remember your statistics, when you learned the difference between the mean and the median, and if you went further than that, you learned the difference between arithmetic, geometric, and harmonic means. But you know that all of those things, those odd terms I mentioned, are attempts to even out the effect of extreme scores. And by extreme scores, I mean, for example, I am 67 years old, my son is 17 years old, my daughter is 12 years old. So that makes our average age in this family somewhere around 30-something. Oh, hey, I like that. Except it presents an extremely misleading picture of the age of the average age of our family, or the ages of our family. Now, if we took the median, that's the score in the middle, then the median age of our family is 17. Hey, I like that even better. Okay. What's all that about? Well, what it means is, for example, that if you have a left-right spectrum of this sort, where you have people this way, that way, like that, the further the extreme gets over here, the more the extreme is normalized, the further left you drag this, the majority of the people, or even significant numbers of the people. Not all Democrats are leftist crazies. In fact, not even most of them, I think. On the state level, you sometimes find very little difference at all between the left and the right in terms of what they want the state to do. Depending on the state, there are states in which I think mine being one of them, and in which the difference is pretty extreme. But the point is, the further you drag this line left, the more this looks like extreme right here in there. That's one point I wanted to make. That's the effect of the horseshoe. And that's not, this is why a strictly linear model, whether you bend it into a horseshoe or a circle, is not giving you some fairly crucial information. So if the left starts moving here, then this starts moving here. This starts to look what was previously called the middle or the moderate is now the extreme right. There is one other concept before I get to the graph that I really like that will give you an idea where I'm coming from when I'm talking about left, right, center, libertarian, all is this in here. A fellow named Albert J. Nock, who lived from 1870 to 1945 and wrote a book called Our Enemy the State. And he was rather like his contemporary H.L. Mencken. He was extremely, what we would regard, cynical about government. But he made an odd difference between government and the state. I mean, government is a good thing. The state is what I mean by the bad aspects of government, which actually mirrored a little bit like Tom Paine when his attitude, when he said governments are said governments are a badge of lost innocence. He said the palaces of kings are built upon the ruins of the bowers of paradise. Which was characteristic of the classical liberal, classical radical movements of the time, of the founding fathers, which regarded government as at best an ugly necessity. They said because human nature is not all unicorns and rainbows, that we have a very dark side to us, which if left unchecked will do terrible things. Starting with the first half of the 19th century and such, of course, people began, there were movements with as nice a person as, say, Ralph Waldo Emerson, or as nasty a person as Karl Marx. And yes, he was personally a nasty person yes, he was. Sorry, but I know lots of people like him. But the fact is, he wasn't in his personal life. He wasn't a very decent human being. But you had, like I say, sweet people like Ralph Waldo Emerson who believed that human nature was malleable and perfectible. Well, this is another difference that persists to today. Conservatives say, no, there's a very limited degree in which we can make people better. But, yes, if you have the right type of society, if you have a society in which freedom is commensurate with responsibility and such, that people tend to come out as their best. They tend to come out as benevolent and law-abiding and all kinds of things like that. And again, given not only the right kind of government, but perhaps even more importantly, the right kind of culture. And about that, there is a lot of controversy we will probably go into later. So, Nock said, there are two types of power, two types of ways to get things done, anything to satisfy human needs, and they are social power and state power. And this is something, look at the arrows here. That's the arrow in chemistry for an equilibrium reaction. But is that as one increases, the other necessarily diminishes. As this power of the state to do things for us increases, our power as a society acting in voluntary association to do things for ourselves diminishes, and that there isn't really a way around this. That as one increases, the other necessarily decreases. And unfortunately, you could say, okay, as social power increases, state power should diminish. Yeah, but that almost never happens. It is. Why? Because the state has guns. No doubt we'll deal about that more another time. But anyhow, this is the graph that I like. Now, some people turn this on their head like that and put libertarian at the bottom, but what it is about is again, it takes that old thing about, well, us libertarian classical liberals, we tend to favor a maximum degree of freedom in both the economic sphere and the social sphere. As I said, there are libertarians who say, "Oh, no, 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 that's just too simplistic. It's not deep enough or anything." Well, maybe so, but I would be perfectly delighted if there was a party that represented both. And I'm going to have to say, there's something there that the Republican Party is moving more in that direction than the Democratic Party, in my humble opinion. One, they're getting resigned to things like gay marriage, legal weed, homosexual acts have not been illegal anywhere for a while now. And they've certainly, I mean, there were times when if you got busted shacking up with a guy, or vice versa, or girls with girls, although that almost never happened. Like that, yes, you could go to jail for it, as Lenny Bruce said. Yeah, take a gay guy and lock him up with a bunch of other guys. Yeah, does that make any sense? Furthermore, as some point out, in a prison where the library might forbid Playboy magazine but would have muscular development magazines, yeah, things don't always make sense. So I'm going to look at this. If you graph, okay, with degrees of freedom, this is where is the locus of control in your life? Off to the right on the economic sphere, which means voluntary agreements among human beings to trade their labor, goods, and services free of government interference, legal interference, beyond enforcement of contracts, laws against fraud, misrepresentation, outright theft, and laws forbidding parties to a contract from passing on the cost of externalities, pollution, etc., to people who are not party to the contract. So, and generally personally reasonable. If you've ever sat in on a county commission meeting where they had to approve something like, okay, somebody wants to establish a pig farm somewhere, they've got there are rules and procedures and regulations about this, which are, in my experience at least, entirely reasonable. They want to know how far it is from the neighbors, how far it is from the highways. They want to know, do you have certain provisions? Have you built up to standard? All of them designed to ensure that, one, you can dispose of the waste, you can dispose of the pig shit, and that the smell is not going to spread far and wide. As I say, I've sat in on the permitting progress, and, as far as I can see, it's entirely reasonable. Now, okay, and over here, social freedom, which is all about consensual acts that are generally of a non-economic nature, prostitution being an exception, I say, and so social freedom. Now, this creates four quadrants here. Now, over here, when economic freedom and where are we? Yes, so yeah. Economic freedom and social freedom. They're both going this way. And I'm going to have to amend this. Basically is when you believe that most human relationships, and that human relationships should, to the greatest degree possible, be voluntary. And say up here, libertarianism, classical liberalism, is all about the study of the proposition to the greatest degree possible. Now, obviously, there are some relationships which are not voluntary. One that comes to mind is my children. No, this is, sorry, this is my family, and I'm really a pretty indulgent parent. But no, it's not a democracy. Now, as they grow, I give them more and more choices. I give them more and more choices in the hope that they will, and I let them make mistakes because that's the way they grow. Now, all right. So up in this quadrant where social and economic freedom, are heading towards the max, we have libertarian conservatives and classical liberals, which are quite close, and then to an extreme degree, libertarians. And way up here, where they both max out at 100%, you have anarchists, people who are impatient with any degree of limitations on your freedom. If you talk about gun control, they'll say, no, you have no right to, restrict me from owning fully automatic weapons, and have a law rocket in my closet. I'm kind of not going for that. No, I don't want you to park your F-16 in your driveway next to mine. Yes, I'm amenable to some kind of restrictions like that, and yes, I realize that over here there are people who will seize on any of those. Now, down here, where you have what you would call the authoritarian right and the social conservatives. By the way, I would point out a characteristic piece of literature up in this quadrant here, the libertarian conservative quadrant, is the Declaration of Independence, which is, as G.K. Chesterton said, the only piece of theoretical politics that is also practical politics and also great literature. I mean, the first part, before you get to the Bill of Particulars against King George, read that. That sucker is dynamite laid in the foundations of every tyranny on the face of the earth. But down here you have social conservatives. Now, the characteristic about piece of literature about this was The Handmaid's Tale, which I will get around to reading sooner or later. The trouble is that I find modern polemical fiction to be tedious. The Handmaid's Tale, which is or Islamism. In other words, Islamism, which is relatively tolerant of certain kinds of business in practice these days. The fact is that Islam forbids charging interest. But they mostly get around that these days. They wheel and they deal, and in fact, they probably ought to be over more towards here because, crony capitalism, business works because you've got the juice, you've got the greed, people. There's no code that even tries to level the playing field. You have basically folks around this area who think that their version of religious morality should be enforced by the state. Now, remember Albert J. Nock over here. This does not mean that people up in the libertarian conservative area are necessarily irreligious. It's that they think that individual morality is not the function of the state. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's is not the function of the state. That as long as it does not affect public order to any great degree, then it is between you and your conscience, and between your conscience and God. That's the way it should be. There's even the argument, the libertarian Christian argument, that it is not possible to be virtuous if you are virtuous only because you fear the punishment of the state. That true virtue comes from voluntary obedience to the laws of God, to the strictures of morality. Okay, so this is over here. Now on the left, excuse me, this was the right, let's see, now on the left, I would say, in social freedom, economic freedom, this is actually where you find This is actually where you find the racialists, the white supremacists, the communists, the people who think, now it doesn't, remember here, it doesn't matter what about your life they're restricting. Whether the Nazis are enforcing the Nuremberg edicts, and for example, throwing women in jail for having sexual relationships with Jews, which is, again, this is why the white supremacists wound up on that side, on this side here. And by the way, most white supremacists are economically far more left than they are right. They don't like free enterprise because the essence of capitalism, as one author, Pat Frank, in his apocalyptic novel Alas Babylon, pointed out, said when SHTF, after the bomb drops, after society is scrabbling to survive, you find out very quickly that a chicken raised by a black man tastes just as good as a chicken raised by a white man. You tend to lose any particular social inhibitions you have about dealing with people who are different from you. And note throughout the South, through the old Jim Crow South, how many of the discriminatory laws were about economics, were about you may not deal with that person. Jesus, there was a horrendous, almost forgotten massacre, Ku Klux Klan massacre, I can't even remember the year, but the Klan came in, and who did they target in the black community? Businessmen and professionals. People who were actually in competition for customers. It was, in fact, largely, in a great deal, racially and economically motivated. Now, over here, you have the modern progressives. This is very low degrees of economic freedom, very high degrees of social freedom. And they say, all right, this is where you have let's see, I would point out here, just as 1984 is the classic fictional presentation of a society in which you have neither social nor economic freedom, up here, Brave New World. This is where you have very, very little freedom to think and speak, but basically you can sleep with whomever you want to, and in fact it is encouraged. It's considered odd to sleep with the same person too many times. Like it's which raises whole other questions of, okay, what was the old joke about the sergeant that put in his papers, when I joined the Army, homosexuality was forbidden. Now it's permitted, even encouraged. I'm getting out before it becomes compulsory. The notion in Brave New World, the picture was that promiscuity was pretty much compulsory. And I would also point out, I reread Brave New World when I was living and working in Saudi Arabia. Somehow a copy got into the library of the Industrial Training Center I was there working at, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed when I was when I'd first read it as a teenager. There was a police in Brave New World. It was not just propaganda and social conditioning through drugs and hypnopaedia and such. There was a riot police who would come in and bust heads when the occasion demanded. I'd sort of missed that. There was a gentleman called, oh dear, I've forgotten, but there's a book called The New Totalitarians that was published back in the 1960s. And this guy was talking about Sweden. And he said, all modern tyrannies tend to go on the pattern of 1984, what Orwell described as a boot smashing a human face forever. Whereas Sweden had gone the way of social conditioning and social control, that when they controlled education from a very early age. This is going to be very important when I make points in future episodes. When they, for example, wanted, this fellow claimed that when the Swedish social planners decided that people should live in multifamily dwellings rather than individual houses, that what they did was they somehow encouraged school children to be mean to their playmates whose families lived in single houses in the urban areas and such and such. I don't know. It's been a while since I've read that also, but at any rate, this is where I think we are these days, and this is the right is roughly this quadrant here, the left roughly here. And do you remember what I said about an extreme element drags the line to one side, so that what was previously moderate, if it had gone the other way, if the right had been taken over by its most extreme elements, then of course a liberal, but I mean the kind of liberal who reads Playboy, who really reads Playboy for the articles as well as the centerfolds, but who favors probably decriminalizing weed. Maybe he's not so sure about hard drugs, and yeah, he wants gays tolerated, but maybe he's not too sure about gay marriage or something like that. He then becomes an extreme leftist. But that isn't the way things broke. The way things broke was that the left is now represented mostly by its most extreme elements, and is being dragged even farther left by a new generation, much to the consternation, by the way, of the older leftists in the Democratic Party, who see their position being threatened by the young Turks of their own movement. So, and notice, those leftists, those young extreme leftists, think the older leftists, like Nancy Pelosi and such like that, they regard them as middle of the roaders, or even maybe how long is it going to be before they start calling them rightists? So anyhow, those are a few of my thoughts about left, right, center, up, and down, and it's going to be relevant when I talk about them later. So before I say good night, I would like to show you a couple of things. One is I am going to, as soon as I can figure out, I am going to be establishing a Patreon account, and I don't know how I'm going to work it. I would like to have my work spread as widely as possible because I would like it to be discussed. I would also like to make some money off of this. This is a book of my collection of my newspaper columns, The View from Flyover Country, where a rural columnist looks at life. And it's available on Amazon Kindle. Now over here, this is a book of an anthology edited by my friend Mark McYoung, Beyond the Picket Fence, Life Outside the Middle Class Bubble, in which yours truly has an essay called When You're a Stranger in a Strange Land, which is some of my thoughts on surviving when you venture into some of the more dodgy corners of the world. So, and if you would like to buy either one of them, I actually get some money from Flyover Country. The other one I get some glory with because I'm in some very, very good company in that collection of essays. So I will say good night, or rather, good very early in the morning. This is Steve Brown, and this has been Rants and Raves Video Edition.